Normal people become terrified of criminals.
Shots were just fired. Police just came out and told us, and we're headed there right now.
They become terrified of their own government.
Florida Rep. Cory Mills flies to Israel to rescue 32 Americans trapped amid fighting. But that was October 12th. That number is much, much higher. And it's not just that you flew missions to save people, rescue people in Israel, it's Afghanistan as well.
Right.
So I'd like to start with Afghanistan. If you can talk to us about what happened, how it happened, what prompted you to actually fly in and start getting some of these people out, and then we can get into obviously the Israel stuff.
So I get a call, and I'd known Ronnie Jackson for quite some time. I mean, this is a guy who's a rear admiral who served on the Armed Services Committee, who's a member of Congress. And literally he called me and said, Cory, I've got a problem. He's like, I've tried to reach out to the State Department. I tried to reach out to the Department of Defense. I've tried to see what we could do to try and get some of my constituents who are trapped in Afghanistan, who are being actively hunted right now by the Taliban. And I said, well, who is it? And so he disclosed who it was, and it was a mother and her 3 children, a 15-year-old, an 11-year-old little girl, a 15-year-old boy, and a 2-year-old little girl. And he literally had no idea how to get them out, even though here he is a member of Congress, and he's calling the right people who would have jurisdiction and approval on this authority. And the things that they were telling him was absolutely false. They would tell him, oh, well, she can just call the State Department and they'll direct her. And she did this time and time again to no answer. Or she would text them, just to give you an idea. And I told Ronnie, I said, look, I'm going to go over there. I said, and I won't come back until I get them. And that's one of the things that he's said multiple times. And, we were attempted to be thwarted in our efforts by the Biden administration multiple times. I mean, even had them scramble an F-16 to do a flyover to try and intimidate us, even though we had approved landing permits on a PPR. And we're in an American aircraft with American former special operations guys to save Americans. And it's our own government who's trying to put us at risk. But, after 11 days, we ended up conducting this successful overland rescue, which is the first of its kind. 2.5 weeks later, after Miriam and her children are already in Amarillo, Texas, they're already back in school. She starts receiving text messages from the State Department saying, hey, we're just reaching out to you to see if you're okay and find out where you're at in Afghanistan. They didn't even know that she had been back safely. I mean, this is the inept and fecklessness of this administration. This is the dereliction of duty by Secretary Lloyd Austin, by Anthony Blinken, the open borders under Mayorkas, the weaponization under Garland and Wray. I mean, all of these people need to be held accountable, but we don't do anything but talk about it. We're more likely to oust someone from our own party than to go after the people who are actually needing to be impeached.
Well, so I mean, like Bowman should be expelled for the fire alarm thing, but instead it's Santos,
who, by the way, is the first person in history to not be convicted of an actual crime and or committed treason. I mean, look, it's happened 5 times before Santos. 3 people in 1861, which was right after the Confederate, had deemed these individuals to be treasonous, and the other 2 who were convicted felons. And now you got a guy who, and this is why I voted against this expulsion, is that who are we to play judge, juror, and executioner, first off? Who are we to not allow him due process to be able to approach his accusers in his day of court in front of a jury of his peers? Because what this does, in my opinion, is that I think that he has every right to a potential appeal now, because I think that we have in some way could have potentially influenced or started to lead the witnesses in the jury in some way just by our actions in Congress. Because now what we're saying is in America, you are actually guilty until proven innocent, not innocent until proven guilty.
It's going to prejudice any jury pool because this is national level politics.
That's right.
Can Congress just expel anybody at any time if they vote on it?
Technically, they can.
Okay, so it was everything that happened was above board, but it just is like
but he's not convicted of anything.
And it's a weird precedent to set, right?
It is.
I mean, we just decided that we don't want you here anymore.
Yeah,
there's not an actual crime.
You should have to run that through the Senate or at least by the American people.
Well, and let me be clear. I'm not trying to defend anything that George Santos has done. But what I am defending is the rights to due process for every single American. Mm-hmm. I mean, what kind of precedents does this set?
It was basically
that's what we have to be thinking about.
The House Ethics Committee report and decision was enough for everyone to say, okay, that's good.
Well, it wasn't everyone.
Not everyone, but for them, enough people to say, okay, we should expel him.
Unfortunately, but you also had people like a lot of the New Yorkers who were in difficult positions because since he's also from New York, they felt that they had to take action because they were hearing it a lot from their constituents. But also, here's my other thing. Who are we in Congress to basically make a decision to expel someone who was elected by 750,000 people in their district?
Yeah.
We should allow the constituents to be able to do their jobs and to be able to go ahead and carry out their civic duties. And again, this for me is more about protecting your Sixth Amendment, more about protecting the rule of law, and due process, but also protecting the vote of constituents so that they can actually have the rights to elect or not elect whomever they choose.
Yeah, it sounds like it's become a little bit too much of a social club of people that think they're elite and they can just, I mean, technically they can still kick each other out, but I do think that it's like, you don't like my guy? Well, he's my guy.
Well, but think about it. Jamal Bowman admits to doing something wrong while a member of Congress.
Committing a crime.
And actually is charged for that. He gets censured. A guy who does something which was previous in most cases of what his indictments for the grand jury is being accused of, in my understanding, is prior to coming in and has not yet been prosecuted for it, but he gets expelled.
Is it just legit?
We
We
have Bowman on camera. If they were going to expel someone before a conviction, Bowman I would understand as being reasonable because he's on camera.
I don't even justify that, whether it's on camera or not. We should allow the due process to be there. We can't say that we, again, are being judged during execution based on our observance. You are not guilty by the observations in which you make. You are guilty by the rendered verdict by either the judgment of a judge, who we appoint for solid reasons, or the jury, which actually finds their peer guilty. I mean, we just have to understand we're a nation which is based on the rule of law. We're a constitutional republic. And we have to not continue to water that down and dilute it just because it's beneficial for us.
You brought up the impeachment of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and he was basically largely responsible for the surrender of the American military.
Him and Anthony
Taliban.
Blinken, the Secretary of State.
So what would an impeachment look like? What would be the charges and how would that play out?
My charge on him was the dereliction of duty. I mean, the simple fact that he has a role to play and a job to do. You had soldiers who were deployed who had no rules of engagement, no understanding of what their authorization of force was. I mean, there's people who could have actually, and in one case, a guy named Tyler Vargas, Andrews, I believe is his name, or Tyler Andrew Vargas, I always mess this up. But he was badly injured and is an amputee as a result of the explosion. He was the sniper who was in the tower who actually had identified the potential suicide bomber, had called back what he appeared to be the identified bolo, which is the be on the lookout, had it verified, was asking for a green light to be able to engage, and never received a green light from any of his command because they didn't know who actually had the authority to give that. Moments later, the explosion goes off. 13 brave members have lost their lives. These are things where you should have an escalation of force and a rules of engagement that's established prior to them even being deployed. You should have an understanding of what was going on. And so this was completely just botched from the very beginning. And the fact that there's no one who's been held accountable. And look, when I think about accountability, I think about it as you lead by example. And so it's, for me, I used to call it the concept of windows and mirrors. When something is being done properly, and everything is going successfully, you look through the window at all those outside who are actually delivering on that. But when something goes wrong as a leader, you have to look in the mirror because ultimately it's on you.
This seems like a pattern, though. I mean, there are several Republicans, I think Andy Biggs or is it Biggs or Briggs from Arizona? He brought dereliction of duty impeachment charges against Mayorkas.
Absolutely.
For the border, because the border's a mess. But
I don't think anyone can argue that's not
No,
justified.
Mayorkas should definitely be impeached, but we haven't gotten it yet. I mean, there are lots of members of the Biden administration who I would believe are derelict in duty, but they are still in office. At what point do we get some action? I mean, it must be difficult.
Look, this is what frustrates me. And obviously, the one thing that I agree with is that we in the 118th Congress brought back through our conference rules the regular order, which means that everything has to go through its committee of jurisdiction and then come out of that and then come to the House floor. But I mean, look, if we can't even at least start the impeachment process, why can't we utilize things like the Homan Act, where we basically take the salary of those individuals and we drop it down to $1 a year? These people shouldn't be getting paid when they actually aren't doing the job that they were actually put in place to do. And so until they can actually have an impeachment inquiry and then trial and have the depositions in place at a minimum, just like if a person in a regular, I think about this from the regular world. If you do something wrong in a job and they're investigating what you did wrong, in many cases you get you basically get leave, from the job for a certain period of time, but you're not being paid during that time. You haven't lost your job yet.
You can also go to jail before you've been convicted.
That's exactly right. See, my whole point is that at least with the Homan rule, we could at least drop his salary down to $1 while we continue to investigate. And
someone proposed this for Corinne Jean-Pierre, right?
We could suspend Bowman pending a conviction on the thing with the doors, the fire alarm.
Very possible.
What's the
but
Homan
will
rule?
they? And they won't. That's the problem.
I mean, look, you got someone on camera committing a crime. I think it's a good point. He should be convicted. But at the same time, there's a reasonable step between, okay, someone's been accused of a crime and there's a preponderance of evidence that they may be violent, so we're going to hold them.
Right.
If they're found to be not guilty, we release them, and we're supposed to have hearings for this. If there is someone who there's no preponderance of evidence he's been accused, well, then you don't even get an indictment. But if you do, then the person is going to be free on bail.
That's right.
So considering Santos, he's been accused. They say there's evidence. Okay, well, you're going to have to prove that. For Bowman, he lied about what he did. The camera proves he lied, and he committed a crime. I would say it's fair to suspend him pending a resolution.
It's the Homan rule. So how do you enact the Homan rule?
It's essentially a privilege resolution, I believe, that you could put on the floor. But last time that we've tried it multiple times by a lot of us who are true constitutional conservatives who believe in accountability of government, and it wouldn't get the votes.
Okay, so it's just a one bill, one vote kind of thing.
I mean, with some of these things, like I mentioned, potentially impeaching Alejandro Mayorkas, do you think there's a point where Democrats would cede, yes, the border is a disaster?
Well, I mean, I think that you even see that from New York City Mayor Adams, right?
Right.
I mean, he's even crying about it. And it's funny that now the sanctuary cities, oh, come on in, we're inviting you in, oh, come on in,
and New York
are the
New
ones
York
that are
was
not
the first to
complaining
be
the most,
like,
right?
this is actually a problem. I mean,
That's
DC
exactly
has
right.
said we need help, but they haven't actually.
Well,
put the same
DC said
fight.
they needed help, but only after we had to pass things like the DC crime bill to stop the soft on crime catch and release policies of, these woke and these liberal extreme mayors like Muriel Bowser or, even Eric Adams or any of the rest. But like my whole point is that there's more than enough circumstantial evidence for us to be able to move forward with impeachment articles against, if anyone, it's Secretary Mayorkas, because we get the CBP reports. I mean, you're seeing the record high numbers that are coming across. You're seeing an increase in the number who are actually coming across that are on terrorist watch lists. I mean, this is the whole thing. And this isn't people from South America. And that's what people have to understand. 6,300 to 6,400 Afghans. I mean, 32,000 plus, Chinese from mainland China. You've got people from Yemen. You've got people from Saudi Arabia. There is a dozen plus different countries who are coming through our southern borders. And I don't think that we can say that Secretary Mayorkas is doing anything to actually prevent that, because in fact, he's the same one that went on record to say we don't have open borders.
Right.
It just
And the
it
Biden
baffles
administration
me.
will say we're doing the best job ever on the border.
Well, but here's a great thing in the hypocrisy of the Biden administration. They'll tell you that they had to repeal Remain in Mexico agreement, or that they had to
Which they
remove
then
Title 42.
reinstated.
But then they'll come back to you and say, oh, the entire failed Afghan withdrawal, we couldn't do anything about it. It was already in motion because of the Trump administration. It's the hypocrisy and the lies that come out of this administration is just something I've never seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, that if they call it a failed withdrawal, they should retitle that as surrender, because that's what that was. A disgusting surrender to the strongest military on earth, surrendered to the Taliban.
Not to mention the billions of dollars that we left behind in weapons, defense articles, and we put terrorist organizations like the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, and ISIS Khorasan in a better position now than they ever were before. And let's go back. Why did we go into Afghanistan in 2001? It was because we wanted to stop it from being a safe haven or a harbor for terrorism. Meanwhile, fast forward to the Biden administration, where we actually left them after what I would argue still that George W. Bush and even Obama had these failed approaches that we can do nation building, which is not our role. We're not there to build the nation of others. We're there to basically eliminate terrorists who are actually a threat to America and come back home to protect our homelands. But, let's fast forward that to the point that we did the opposite of what we said that we were going there to do. We actually emboldened and strengthened and armed and trained and even left enough cash to create the caliph if they want. The opposite of what the intent was.
That's why I'm not satisfied with surrender. I think it's going too easy on them.
It is.
I don't understand how you abandon Bagram without informing the security forces.
I think it's treason what they've done.
Yeah, I agree. That again, a surrender would be like, okay, let our forces know we're out.
But here's
something else is when
we
you
have
abandon
we have never pulled our military in our history. We've never pulled our military before we ensured the safety of civilians first. I mean, the idea that we're going to pull our military before we even try and make sure that American citizens are out first to be saved.
But why? But the Bagram thing gets me because
It's against doctrine.
We could have evacuated through Bagram.
Absolutely, we could have.
Okay, so let's say
And I've been to Bagram multiple times. You could have. Here's the other big thing that you have to understand. We could have simultaneously run two separate airports, right? You could allow the continuation of the civilian HKIA that was going on, and you could have gone ahead and utilized Bagram, which, by the way, could have housed 40,000+ people. We could have done the necessary biometrics health scans to look at our SIVs and others who actually had served with us for over 20+ years, risking their lives, instead of just abandoning and leaving them behind, who are being now methodically killed, one by one. But the other thing is that what did it have? It had an entire military installation, a perimeter standoff. Yeah. So what ended up happening, and this is where the Biden administration hasn't been answering for this yet, when they shut down Bagram to hand it over to China, and they went ahead and allowed the Bagram prison, which released over 40,000 terrorists who had actually already been incarcerated there,
40,
to be released. Yes. Who had been, which basically plussed up the entire force that was already coming in. Now, what else did you do? When you take a military takeover of a civilian airport, all of those flights, because they were telling all the Americans you have to be out by September 11th. He wanted to tout this great victory on this day. But when he shut it down premature to that, all the people who had civilian flights out on Ariana, Cam Air, Emirates, you name it, those airliners got completely canceled. So there was no more Calm Air that could come in and come out. So they essentially entrapped Americans by shutting down the civilian airport and giving them no safe harbor to be able to get out.
I pulled up the name. It's Tyler Vargas Andrews.
Correct.
He's the dude.
Absolute hero.
He was in a tower, you were saying?
That's right.
And then they were surrounded, or they were people coming at them?
They had already been told that day of what the bolo was, which is to be on the lookout of the individual, what he'd be wearing, what he'd be carrying, a satchel, these types of things. While he was up there in the tower, identified an individual who fit that description, who he believes is the actual bomber, the suicide bomber. He then relayed that information back, and someone came to the tower to confirm exactly what he saw from, I believe it was the PSYOPs battalion that was there. And they confirmed what he saw, and then he asked for green light to engage, and no one in his command or even at higher command knew who could actually provide that authority. So no one gave him the authority. Moments later, explosion occurs, and we saw what happened.
First thing, he did a show with Sean Ryan. It's spectacular, and Tyler's awesome, and it's like 5.5 hours long, and everyone should go watch that. The guy's amazing. So is this like obsessive centralized control authority thing like new? Is it normal? Because I would think you'd have somewhere in the lower levels of command that are like at least equipped to give you an order or to respond to your request for action.
Well, you usually, in every scenario I've ever seen, you always have command who can actually issue that authority. And you always have a clear understanding of what your rules of engagement are, what the escalation of force is. And the bottom line is that this was a chaotic, botched withdrawal that endangered American lives. And I can tell you that Secretary Blinken was even given a diplomatic cable, with 23 members of the diplomatic corps who warned him about this strategy, saying Americans would die. They tried to hide that from our Foreign Affairs Committee until the point that we actually were trying to subpoena, Chairman McCall was subpoenaing Anthony Blinken for the fact that he wouldn't and refused without the redacted lines on it, which was basically the entire document, to show this. But here's what we ended up asking. We asked a woman who had been responsible for filing those types of cables, and we said, in your entire time, and she was almost done with her career, I think she had 17 plus years, have you ever seen, how many of these cables do you get a year? What they call a descent cable. And she said somewhere between maybe 1 to a year on average. And we said, okay, great. How many people usually are signatories on these documents? And they said 1, maybe 2 people. And I said, so it didn't send a red flag when you had 23 people who are part of the diplomatic corps of the State Department who signed this descent cable warning about this withdrawal prior to it happening? So all the signs were there. All the intel was there. There was intel reports, by the way, that even demonstrated who and when and what was going to happen. They even, to the point where the days before they would say, okay, these individuals are moving from this city to this city. Next day, they're now in the city. Next day, they're in a planning phase. Next day, they're now done with the plan. Here's how it's going to be carried out. And then boom, the next day it occurred. So Blinken and Austin can't say that they didn't have the details and the information on how to prevent this. They are responsible, and there's blood on their hands, and there has to be accountability.
I don't think it's a strategy. I don't see any reasonable argument for abandoning Bagram. It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't.
The only reason you would do that is to create chaos, disorder, and intentionally get people killed.
Or unless China and others are trying to tell you that you need to go right now because you're a compromised and corrupted administration, and you're now leaving, by the way, $1.1 trillion in lithium. So which is sitting in Panjshir.
You think there's compromise on Biden or the administration? China says, we're taking the base, we're taking the country, and you're getting the F out.
Who was the first person who recognized the Taliban as an actual form of government? Chinese.
China's moving in. They're going for the lithium mines.
100%.
It could also be, it could be compromise, but could it also be Biden just selling
But think about it, though, for a minute. Just put this together. You're now handing over a country, putting Americans at lives so that the Chinese can get to $1.1 trillion in potential lithium. And at the same time, What are you pushing for? You're pushing for an EV system, which is based out of lithium, cobalt, and nickel, which is all produced by China
Handing it over to China.
build their economy. These are not, and this is where, being a geopolitical analyst for a long time, you don't look at everything so singularly. You start making the link analysis of, look, this is not a one-off. Look, and it's not just kind of this coincidence. In police work, they call them clues. And so what we have to understand is that that's exactly what is going on, is that we are driven towards building China's economy and going to a more China one, foreign first policy, as opposed to an America first policy where we actually look out for our own. And that's because of the corruption. And that's because of what you're seeing being released by Chairman James Comer, Chairman Jim Jordan, Chairman Jason Smith, where they're showing the multitude of layers of corruption and the spider webs of companies and the continuation of this 10% for the big guy and the millions upon millions of dollars that Jim and Haley and Hunter and all of them are getting. Look, this is the most corrupt and most bought and paid for pay-for-play administration that I've ever seen in my lifetime.
So what do we do, man?
We impeach his ass.
Joe Biden?
I'm down.
We hold accountability. We return the power back to the American people. We start actually being true constitutionalists who understand that our overspending, which I've talked about this previous when we were on the, going into the show, but we're running into an economic abyss, and we keep acting like we can cut our way to prosperity. You can't. Ask any business owner out there. If you can cut your way to profitability, you can't. Your account receivables have to exceed your account payables. And if they don't, then you're insolvent as a business. The difference is, as a business, when you have to go and get a line of credit, or you have to go to a bank, you have to prove your ability to actually pay it back. What American government does is they utilize the American people as a taxpayer who is the bank, but they don't have to justify how they actually pay it back. They don't have to actually show a business plan on what they're actually doing, and they think they can cut their way to prosperity as opposed to focusing on what they need to, which is proper reform on the nearly 73% of mandatory spending that is going on, understanding you have to have a cut strategy, which, yes, that is part of it, to try and make sure that programs and things that we're spending on is no longer, doing their purpose or serving their purpose, or is eliminated, but also an economic growth strategy that allows us to understand how do we get that GDP to national debt inverted ratio back to a point where we can even be stable, one, but also where we can back it by tangible assets that allow our dollar and our currency to have confidence across the global market for even the developing nations that are utilizing it.
Who's co-sponsoring your impeachment bill?
With the Lloyd Austin,
yeah,
we had quite a few signatures on there.
Yeah, anyone who you weren't expecting to jump on?
No, actually, it's exactly the type of America First conservatives that you would imagine.
You gave me some crazy numbers before we went live about what our every dollar the government borrows, it's what, 70?
So this continues to change, obviously, as every second we get more. But essentially, think about it from this perspective, right? When you hear your representative or your senator talk about how they're making the biggest cuts ever to spending, I want to get an understanding of what that means. Every dollar that we borrow, roughly 73 cents of that, we'll call it 70 cents. 70 cents of that is spent already just on the mandatory spendings. And then as our debt continues to increase, as the actual interest rates on that debt continues to increase, roughly right now, around 11 cents of every single dollar is just servicing our interest payments. And then you look at our defense spending, which I think we can argue, with good understanding that we need a strong military. That's 13, 14 cents of every dollar, at $860 to $870 billion that we're spending on our military per year, which is needed because we don't even have our necessary classes for the Columbus class and things like that for our submarines and others. But that's spent which means that your representative, your senator, the person that's telling you we're making these massive cuts, what they're talking about is we're taking a 20%, a 30% cut. Yeah, you're right. A 20 to 30% cut on the remaining 9 cents or so that you can actually touch. Which, in the scheme of things, those cents that you're cutting on that is not going to get us, again, you're not cutting your way to prosperity without having an economic growth strategy, without decoupling ourselves away from the adversarial nations, without getting control of our supply chain, our resources, and rare earth minerals that are necessary for us to support an industrial-based build-out. We're not going to be able to do this based on DC status quo, that we're going to spend our way out of this, or we're going to be able to cut our way to prosperity. It's a lie.
The numbers add up to like 95% of every dollar we borrow is automatically spent. So of that these are rough numbers, of the remaining 5%, if they cut 20% of that 5 cents and
Again,
it's like 1 cent or less.
You're still not getting your way to a way of prosperity.
And they'll tell people they're cutting 20% of the budget of the spending, but it's only of the 5 cents on a dollar. They're cutting 20% of the 5 cents. That's like less than 0.5 of a cent. Percent. Like, okay, so that's crazy. Now let's talk about GDP growth. You told me before the show you believe it's energy. I think it's energy. I think we should transition it into a hydrogen-based fuel economy. I'm bullish on this. Coming out of Rice University, they're making hydrogen gas out of recovered carbon trash, hit it with electricity at 7,000 degrees. They flash it, turn it into hydrogen fuel. They're left over with $4.50 of this.
So let's jump in it though. How many oil refineries are in the United States?
Corey might know better than I do.
We haven't built an oil refinery since like the 1970s.
No, but how many do we have?
I think, 2 or 3?
Is that it?
I think so.
Then Ian's idea stands.
I really couldn't.
There you go.
I really don't know the exact number on that, but I can tell you that we haven't built a refinery since I believe it was the 70s. But the bottom line is that here's the issue. I don't think that's an either or, and you always hear this from the left and the right. You know, I'm all for the idea of drill, baby, drill. Look, trust me, I like the idea of continuing to produce fossil fuels, looking at LNG. I like the idea of us basically continuing to look and explore renewables, looking at nuclear, which, by the way, is the cleanest, safest. Everyone wants to argue 9 Mile Island or Chernobyl or, you know, the issue that happened in the, I can't remember the name of the Japanese reactor that was
Fukushima.
Out there.
I got a fact check for you.
Yeah.
The last refinery was built in February 2022. There are currently 129 operating in the United States.
That's a lot more than I actually anticipated.
But it does look like it's, maybe one every decade or so, one every 8 years. What do they say?
It definitely doesn't keep up with our current growth and what our utilization is. I mean, but going back to my point of the renewable, reliable argument, it has to be both. We have to be able to look at multiple things, but we have to understand that if we're going to basically go off of this, gold standard, which we did, I believe it was around 1971 or 1973, I can't recall, and go to the petrodollar, that dollar has to be backed by some type of a tangible production. And that right there, because to your point on the GDP, we had passed H.R. 1, which was a bill that Steve Scalise put onto the floor, which is the Low Cost Energy Act, which basically gets us back to a more energy dominant position. But at the same time, we passed H.R. 21, which would prevent the president from draining down our strategic petroleum reserves that he has actually done at a record level that we've never seen before. So if we go to this and we start actually producing energy and we back our dollar by this in the way that we should, then every single time, especially if we look at energy output, because I agree with you, Ian, in this, the global currency, which is the whole point, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have continued to modify their constitution to stay in power forever because they want to do what? They want to eliminate the U.S. dollar from the global currency. They want to throw us into hyperinflation. They want to utilize the corruption of WHO and WEF, who, by the way, I co-sponsored the bill with Chip Roy that would actually stop us from directly or indirectly even funding any of the WHO. I think it's a complete, farce. But my whole thing is that we have to start basing our valuation, our spending cap, on what our energy production is, which also would incentivize every president on the left and the right to produce as much as possible to have the most spending levers. But it would weaken OPEC, who, when they try and threaten us and say, we're cutting our production by 100,000 barrels, we go, oh, great. So the price of oil goes up. We have more money to spend. Great. Thanks for that. So my whole thing is you decouple away from the utilization, but also things like U.S. aid, where we continue to utilize cash diplomacy, where we're sending, for example, $800 million to a country that absolutely hates us, and we think that's going to turn around and they're going to go, you know what, we love you now, America. No, they're going to say, we still hate you, but we're $800 million on taxpayers' money richer.
We're like divorced dads trying to bribe kids into
correct.
loving us.
And not only that, but think about it. And I don't like to build up anything that another nation's doing that's kind of an adversary of us, but what Russia did with Germany was convince them to get rid of, after 20 years, all of their nuclear and coal energy and be completely dependent upon them. We could actually stop cash diplomacy under U.S. aid, supply low-cost, reliable energy to developing nations, which would also ensure that they continue to stay on side with America. But also, guess what? It's revenue coming into the U.S. It's not us pouring tax money dollars into another nation and continuing to send things out.
Yeah, the petrodollar needs to be converted to a hydrogen dollar. I know we can do it. And the oil industries, all you execs out there listening, will turn your oil into graphene. We're not going to stop drilling. It's going to get even better.
Okay, so the reason I asked about how many refineries there were is because, first, before we're going to transition the U.S. economy from oil to hydrogen, you need comparable energy production for which you are able to do it.
That's true.
Right now, one of the big challenges with electric vehicles, for instance, is charging them. And so what you hear a lot about is batteries. Oh, what's the range on the vehicle? Actually, range is no issue for us. So with the Tesla, You park it, you charge it. You never drive far enough to where we even care about what the charge is, because once you bring it home, it's charging. The issue is, if you want to travel far, you need to be able to refill it very quickly. So you do need good batteries. But so adoption is going to come from expansion of technology. Now, as for like hydrogen fuels and fusion or anything else, someone's going to have to be able to run their car off of hydrogen energy, which is going to require an EV. We are not even at the point where people can use EVs reliably, because gas, you fill up your car in 30 seconds.
And in some ways safely, right? Because we saw where, like in Florida, for example, where we were having floods, and these batteries were essentially
blowing up.
They were blowing
crazy.
up, and endangering people. We really need to think about also just the safety and reliability. And Ronnie Jackson said this the best. He said, "Look, it's a simple thing. I'll take reliable over renewable." And again, I think that it has to be both. I think we have to be able to have an understanding and a choice for every single American, which is why, we just voted down, by the way. The Biden administration wanted to force every American by 2032 to go completely to EV.
Right.
And luckily, we in the House, I don't know what the Senate will do with this, we voted it down because we believe that just like whether it's medical freedom, whether it's school choice, we are supposed to be providing freedom, liberty, and protection of the rights of every American people, not telling them you need more government in your life.
The issue with the renewables is that they're, as you described, not as reliable. So with chemical energy, with petroleum, the reason why I don't see the U.S. getting off of a petroleum economy is because it is a dense, extremely dense chemical storage of energy, which can be utilized whenever.
Yeah, it's fuel. There's only 3 elements that can function as fuel. It's hydrogen, carbon, and plutonium. And so we're using the carbon in the oil, but we can use the hydrogen fuel. It's just transportable. If you can put it in a box and move it around, it becomes a fuel. Like producing steam is not fuel.
But the issue is with, so there's theoretically a hydrogen cell. You can do hydrogen tanks in cars.
And if those could charge the batteries.
And so, but you can do hydrogen combustion vehicles, which people have, and they're really cheap to operate, or natural gas cars. And then you need to retrofit every single gas station. And you need to build the refineries.
Or you can build engines that are hybrid hydrogen petroleum engines. And so you could use either. I think that's where we're going.
At the end of the day, you know what I want? I want people to be able to heat and cool their houses at a fraction of what they're using right now. I want fuel prices for whatever it is that you drive to be affordable for every single individual. And I want us to get away from the idea that we're continuing to stay reliant on adversarial nations.
I agree.
How we get there is, I'm less concerned with it as much as needing to get there and finding the solutions.
I want to jump to the story from Barron's. U.S. military holds exercises in Guyana as border tensions soar. Oh boy, I'm glad the U.S. is down there as Venezuela's building up its military on their eastern front, because they're claiming basically half the country of Guyana as their territory. Why? Exxon discovered a bunch of oil. So the U.S., of course, is down there. Guyana has asked for the U.S. to help prevent a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. Venezuela, of course, just sees dollar signs. Well, not necessarily dollar signs.
And they're one of the
Bolivar
most
Fuerte
resource
signs.
wealthy. They're the most resource wealthy in South America.
Yeah, they got oil.
Venezuela.
Now they want to steal more. So I guess the two big issues here are, welcome to the issue of you're never going to get off oil because it is just too valuable. It is relative to hydrogen or nuclear. It's easy to get. It's easy to use. It can be stored in easy containers.
It is absolutely amazing, and I don't want to get off of it. I just want to build alternate systems that we can use in conjunction with it. Because plastics, maybe we can make better plastics with carbon, but with graphene, you can upscale these things into better materials. But oil is incredible. It is very valuable.
Right. But so the subject I want to get into is, you think we're going to get into another war? You think war's spreading out of South America?
Look, I would say that weakness invites aggression. And we have to acknowledge that the Biden administration has continued to demonstrate this weakness on the world stage, which is why we are where we are. I think that all of our enemies and our adversarial nations, again, if you go back, I wrote about this years ago about the Russia, China, Iran, and North Korean geopolitical alignment. They're utilizing not just their alignment to try and go ahead and expand out the Belt and Road Initiative or to take the 15 of 16 rare earth mineral mines, but to expose us and drag us into these quagmire wars where we can continue to drain down on what we have as far as defense articles within our own storage capacity and capabilities, what are they're testing for their own intelligence, what our industrial base can actually withstand with regards to production capacity and capability, and whether we could actually stand up to an actual large scale war. But they're continuing to also drag us into areas, because think about it, Venezuela is partnered in its marriage of convenience with Russia. we were actually starting to focus a lot on the Belt and Road Initiative expansion by looking at certain types of a sanction or looking at certain types of a internationally recommended transit corridor for supply chain stuff. What China is trying to achieve is this, and that's why, and it does play into this, and I'll explain this how. They essentially want to take this Belt and Road Initiative, which expands the Eurasian border, takes Africa and Oceania, and that would cut off Western Hemisphere supply chain, whether it's the Red Sea, Mediterranean, Black Sea, Persian Gulf, Horn of Africa, while simultaneously utilizing this marriage of convenience with Russia to take Venezuela with the Chavez of Venezuela, Pedro in Colombia, and then look at economic coercion in countries like Panama and Honduras so that they can actually also start taking over the trade tariff taxes and everything on the Panama Canal so that they could also pinch us there. But they had to draw us away from what they were doing in that Belt and Road Initiative by actually focusing in our own Western Hemisphere. I mean, look, they're also, in addition to all of the things that's going on here, they are also building up the largest joint training spy base in Cuba, which is an impact to me as a Florida resident who is 90 miles off my shore. And so this issue that we're seeing in Venezuela is nothing more than that continuation of that Belt and Road Initiative or that geopolitical alignment between China and Russia, where they're trying to draw us into more of this while they continue to do a resource grab. And to your point earlier, to tie this in a bow, that's because it's not about the US dollar as the global currency or the rial or the dinar or the yen or the ruble or whatever. Energy is the global currency.
And
who
specifically,
has the most wins?
specifically fuel. It's fuel because energy can be produced locally but can't be transported. Like nuclear power plants can't transport properly to Afghanistan, whereas fuel can be picked up, lifted, and moved.
Pretty simple. Get our GDP to national debt ratio inverted, secure our borders, stop the wokeism, get our industrial base built out, start thinking about energy dominance. We have to start just thinking about the priorities of government.
What
Do you think that the U.S. could handle a large-scale war right now?
I think that we could handle a large-scale war, but I don't think that America is ready for a large-scale war.
What distinction are you making?
Well, I look at what our industrial base capacity and capabilities are as far as build out. I look at the fact that we're already spread so thin and trying to continue this, as I talked at, and I kind of ridiculed, which rightfully so in my opinion, this neoconservative, neoliberal, 1980s style, of interventionist ideologies that we have to be involved in every war and we have to actually go and make it from a kinetic perspective. I think that we showed our hand the other day whenever, and I voted against it, obviously, but we voted on sending cluster munitions over to Ukraine. Do you know why we actually were starting to dump our storage of cluster munitions? Because, and this is something that's been banned by over 100 different nations, because you have a roughly 1 to 5%, I know it's a wide range, but it's depending on the producer, 1 to 5% dud ratio, which means that you have more UXO, which means you're going to have larger civilian casualties at the end of it. And so we stopped utilizing the clusters, but we did that because our industrial base with the resources and, the capabilities couldn't keep up with what was necessary for the HIMARS and ATACMS and the other areas for 155 artillery shells, things like this. And we're starting to get into what we call our tamer requirement, which is our own munition requirements, and starting to drill into that. And so, we're showing, and again, this is the brilliance of what China and others are doing, which is that they're exposing some of the weaknesses by dragging us into wars that they're not paying a dime on to try and go ahead and look at where our weaknesses are, so that if they do choose to take Taiwan or they do try to go ahead and bring us into the Western Hemisphere, into Guyana or into these things, that we actually, they know what our capability and capacities are. And so, we have to be better. And we also have to understand domestic and foreign policy is intrinsically linked. What we do domestically impacts us internationally and vice versa. And so it's really important for us to try and understand that we have to get our supply chain back. We have to get our resources back. We have to start actually harvesting ourselves. I personally am a big fan of the idea of doing deep seabed harvesting. The earth is 70% water, and there are more natural resources, not talking about drilling, just talking about deep seabed harvesting, mineral harvesting. There is more at the 10,000, 12,000 meter depth levels than what you could find in these 15 of 16 rare earth mineral mines that China has. And China, by the way, controls 100% of manganese production across the world.
Sorry, I'm going to pivot slightly, but were you always a conservative, or did your time in the military sort of shift your perspective?
I have been a registered Republican my whole life and a constitutionalist my whole life. Look, I tell people all the time, the only reason I'm a registered Republican is because we're stuck in this two-party system, and that's the one that essentially is the closest to my conservative values, right? It's not 100% aligned. I think that we've gotten away from the constitutionality.
Do you have to be registered with a party to vote in a primary in Florida?
No, I mean,
because I grew up in Connecticut and you did, so I registered as a Republican.
A lot of NPAs, they are excluded from primaries. But my reasoning is that, there was times when we actually had great Republican members. We still have some today, not to say that we don't. But I also think that what and you know, we're seeing a mass exodus, by the way, you know, of members from Congress.
It's weird.
But it's actually, you know, I think it's a good thing. And I'll tell you why. It doesn't sound good because it doesn't have the numbers that we need, but we're ushering in a new generation of conservative. And we have evolved back to the ways of being a true constitutionalist, being a fiscal conservative, understanding that we represent the American people, being a statesman, not a politician. Look, I've been called almost everything in the world. The most derogatory term that you can call me is a politician. So, you know, my whole thing is I just want to get back to we the people. And I think the only way you do that is through limited government and an understanding of what actually is the America First agenda. And so this is where President Trump, and I've endorsed him from a long time ago, I believe he's exactly what we need in the nation right now to get us back on track to make those bold course corrections.
Yeah, you said deep sea resource harvesting.
Deep seabed.
How does that work? Is that like with drones?
You can do it with drones. And here's the great part. I still think that we should be utilizing the quantum space where, you know, for example, do you remember when Reagan had bankrupted the Soviet Union with the space race?
No, I didn't know he did that.
Yeah. So we should be also thinking about the idea of how can we actually get China involved in a quantum race whereby they also, because their economy is worse than ours. It's just that the reason that people still prop up their currency is because they don't allow their books to be audited. They lie about what they actually spend and what they actually have. And so we could try and we should try and bankrupt them through a quantum race whereby, you know, being the first to have AI self-healing autonomous drones utilizing like quantum linkage, you know, would be something that we would try and advance in. You know, again, the idea is that if you could get something in a swarm drone technology through quantum linkage that essentially is beneath their satellites but above their GSM tower providers, you could kind of leave someone blind, deaf, and dumb on the battlefield.
Great to communicate through
and
crystals.
So, you know, the idea is that I think that there's ways for us to start thinking about it. And this is why I argue, again, it's not just looking at kinetic warfare, but it's thinking about the ideas of economic, resource, supply chain, cyber, and quantum races. That is the actual way not to include or not to miss out the fact that it's also the information and propaganda and information campaigns that's going on.
What makes me nervous with artificial intelligence, autonomous drones with weapons is if they get hacked. I mean, obviously that's the threat, and I'm sure China's going through the same thing right now. But the thing is, I guess whoever builds it first, and if you've got quantum encryption. You know, the quantum encryption race also is insane because whoever gets that can crack open all the bank records of everyone in the country and release them all the next day.
Well, and the speed in which and the capacity of quantum data computing is just...
But I agree with you. We do need that race because it's dangerous to have autonomous artificial intelligent drones with lasers, but that's where it's headed. So, like, we need to win the race.
Yeah, that quantum entanglement that everyone's trying to rush towards.
I want to ask you if you expected Kevin McCarthy to resign.
I actually didn't. I didn't know it was going to take him this long.
Yeah. So you were like,
Well, he's saying end of the month.
no. What I'm wondering is like, did you guys have a poll going? And you were like,
Well,
They did the squares.
Yeah,
we weren't doing calendar bingo, but I can tell you that I assume
because you're not allowed to. It's against the rules, or because
no, just because we have other things to do.
When it was announced, was the pizza party held for lunch or dinner?
I think instead of a pizza party, everyone was there's probably quite a few offices that was toasting and cheering, and
I don't think anybody. Honestly, nobody cared. Like the news broke, and we kind of just shrugged and ignored.
But then again, you have people who are still in office right now who are just we still want him as speaker. We're not willing to give up. We're not. I mean, so
later it's too bad.
And McHenry announced the day before, and they're supposed to be sort of allies, right? So it seems like there is an exit,
I like Patrick. You know, Patrick McHenry. He was always getting ready. I mean, he's at the end of his ability for chairmanship in the financial services anyway. But a really smart guy. I mean, truly a smart guy.
I mean, he still has another year to go. He doesn't leave.
Right. No, he's not going to just try and abandon the seat. You know, I'll tell you though, and they can think what they want, but I thought the tweet that broke the cycle for me a few days ago was by Matt Gaetz when he tweeted out Mick Leavin.
Mick Leavin.
Yeah, it was like a little tagline.
You saw the community note on his tweet?
I did not.
Like, where he was like, I will never quit. And then it was community note that said, he just quit.
Oh, that's right.
Community note
That's right.
on his tweet saying he wouldn't.
Was he disliked? I mean, this is all anecdotal. I don't know if you can really answer.
Well,
for
he was
anyone
pointing out a lot
else.
of people to like him. So, I mean, it's...
I mean, look,
because I've heard he's a really nice guy, like cool and personable in person, but just wasn't getting the job done.
Well, look.
No, he was getting the job done.
For the other people.
He did for the corporations and for the lobbyists, right.
Well, you know, at the end of the day, I think that if we could have actually achieved what we had originally agreed upon in the first conference rule agreements, you know, when we came out, where we are going to do regular order, we are going to have certain priorities of, you know, getting things done. For me, what really just kind of broke confidence and capabilities was when we had the debt ceiling debate, I was all for the idea once we had gotten permit reform in place and the REINS Act, which stopped overregulation of the private sector, and we had a very fixed number at 1.471 of spending cap, which would have been a very good spending level because that would have been pre-COVID, pre-emergency 2019 spending levels. I understood the intent of that because we were going to try and do a policy rider with HR 2 to also secure our borders. When we approved that, we got that passed. When it went to the Senate, and what came back was that absolute, just complete acquiesce with the what they call Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is Fiscal Irresponsibility Act. That basically took the 20 plus permit reforms down to 4. That stripped out Kat Kamek's REINS Act, which would have stopped. Because I'm one of those odd individuals who believe that the private sector should be driving policy more so than policy driving the private sector. But also the fact is that it's not as if we have a lack of legislation. We have a lack of the ability and the willingness to enforce existing legislation. But every single member of Congress wants their name on a piece of legislation. Everyone wants to try and play political football instead of going back and looking at certain bills that no longer serve their purposes and looking at reforms, as opposed to just continuations of these vague and ambiguous bills that get passed that won't serve its overarching purpose or has no sunset clause in it where we would actually have to be forced to reevaluate it. And so I could go on and on and on. Look, this is my first full year in January that I've been in Congress, but I can tell you that it was a lot more of a broken institution than I even understood when I was running for Congress. And I think that we have taken this entire time, many of us who are in there who are true constitutionalists, to try and bring back what our Constitution and what our actual Congress is supposed to be doing. And an old saying that I've heard recently, which I love, which is that, change in the beginning, it's very hard.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.